Well, beloved, as you know, for the past 9 weeks, we haven't been able to meet corporately as a church. And this is because our governing officials have limited gatherings, not just for churches, but they've limited gatherings because they desire to reduce the spread of COVID-19. We have peacefully submitted to their directives because they are the authorities the Lord Jesus has put over us. We understand the weightiness of being in a position of authority, where they have to make decisions that affect millions of people. We also know that God is sovereign over what's happening. He declares the end from the beginning, and he's carrying out all his good pleasure. His will be accomplished even during this shelter at home. During this COVID-19 crisis, you may have experienced different emotions. Some people are fearful. Their health may already be compromised, and the last thing they want to do is get this virus. Others may be fearful because they have lost their jobs and they're not sure how they're going to make ends meet. Others of you may be discouraged or depressed. You may be struggling spiritually because we haven't been able to meet. Some of you may be angry, questioning the motives of our governing officials and wondering if they really have our best interests in mind, as it seems that we are losing some of our freedoms. These diverse responses are all seen within our own congregation. Well, as your elders, we are concerned for your physical and spiritual well-being. While some of our fellow Californians have suffered the physical effects of the coronavirus, many others have experienced fear, hopelessness, loneliness, despair during this mandatory shelter at home. And these are very real and harmful emotional, mental, and spiritual effects. And the church can minister to people like that who are hurting. And yet, we still have not been able to meet. God, in fact, requires his church to assemble together, to worship him, to sing, to pray, to preach his word, to baptize believers, to take the Lord's Supper together, to comfort one another, to bear one another's burdens, to serve one another, and to address one another in psalm and hymns and spiritual songs. These commands are from God, and they're for the spiritual well-being of his people. And they require us to assemble and are one of the life-sustaining means that God uses to heal and restore our souls. So attempting to weigh out the physical danger of gathering versus the spiritual danger of not gathering has not been easy. How does God want us to respond to all of this? Should we simply be trusting God and his sovereignty and do nothing? Should we do whatever the authorities over us tell us to do without question? Is there a place where we appeal their decision? Should we be opposing our authorities if they are forbidding us to do what God requires? What's the correct option? Well, as you might imagine, answering these questions hasn't been easy. But these are questions that your elders have been wrestling through. While we believe the Lord is shepherding you through this time, we also know that God desires for us to meet, and we believe he can protect us when we assemble, as we take necessary precautions. So with this in mind, the elders are appealing to our governing authorities to allow churches like ours to assemble once again. And so I want to talk about for a few minutes how to appeal to authority. How to appeal to authority. And I want to look at a story in Acts 27 that I think might be a helpful parallel to what we are going through. In this story, we're going to see the sovereignty of God over nature. As Paul and others with him were on a ship bound for Rome, and they find themselves in a storm of hurricane-like proportions that assailed them for weeks. God, we're going to see, is sovereign over storms. We find everyone in this story experiencing the same trial. Everyone was in the storm. And then we find the Apostle Paul in a place where he was under authority, where he makes an appeal to the authority over him. So it has all the elements that we are experiencing right now. God's sovereignty over nature or over a virus. All of us experiencing the same trial, being sheltered at home. And we are in a place where we are under the authority of our governing officials that King Jesus has put over us. So let's work our way through this a little bit. And the first thing I want to talk about is God's sovereignty and how we should respond when under his sovereignty. The Bible teaches, of course, that God is sovereign over everything. Our God is in the heavens. He does whatever he pleases. So knowing God's in control of every situation, how should we respond? Do we do nothing? Are we to simply be passive? Or are we simply to pray and nothing else? Well, just think for a moment God's sovereignty and salvation. We know that God is saving a people. They are his elect that he chose before the foundation of the world. And we know those elect will be saved. So how do we respond to that? Do we do nothing? Does God need us to save them? Well, of course not. He doesn't need us. But we also understand something. God uses means. He uses your proclaiming the gospel, your witnessing, your opening your mouth, your prayers. And so we go witness and proclaim. We go do that, trusting that God's sovereignly going to work. And so in this story, we find Paul, who believed in God's sovereignty, acting. And so let's pick up the story here in Acts 27, verse 9. Luke writes this, when considerable time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. So Paul was on this ship. They had been trying to get to Rome. It had been very hard travel. They finally get to this one city, but it wasn't a city that was fit for wintering. So the captain and the centurion were thinking about trying to get to another city to winter there. Well, at that point, Paul spoke up and said, I don't think that's a good idea. Now, think about this. We know Paul as the great apostle, but on this ship, Paul was a prisoner. So that means he had no rank, no authority. He was a nobody. In fact, he was probably the lowest person on the ship, who probably even didn't know much about sailing. But interestingly, none of these things stopped him from admonishing those over him and voicing his concern. Paul had already been through 3 shipwrecks at least. So from observation of what had been taking place so far on their journey and from experience, Paul wisely counseled them not to go. He wasn't afraid to speak up and say something. He didn't sit passively by and stay quiet because he knew God was sovereign and he knew God knew what he was doing. No, he spoke up because he believed God uses means. And so notice what happens after a little while. They're in the middle of this big, huge storm. And in verse 21, it says this, when they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not to have set sail from Crete and incur this damage and loss. All right, this is the proverbial, I told you so. You should have listened. Yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night, an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve stood before me saying, Don't be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men. For I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I've been told. So here's Paul. We're told that he had a direct revelation from God that no one on the ship would be lost, even though the ship's going to be wrecked. So we know God's purpose is to save every single person on board. And yet what's interesting is that sometime later, when the sailors tried to get off the boat through the lifeboat, that Paul spoke up and he said something to the centurion. And it says this in verse 31. Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Now, wait a second. I thought Paul believed in the sovereignty of God. I thought that he had a revelation that everyone on board would be saved. So why is he saying anything? Well, he realized something. They need skilled sailors, that they were necessary for the safety of the passengers. So Paul took prudent action to bring about what God, by divine revelation, had promised would certainly come to pass. So God's sovereignty doesn't mean we don't act. It doesn't mean that. God uses means. And so in our circumstances today, we don't know exactly what God's sovereign purpose is in specific situations. So in this situation with the coronavirus, we don't know exactly what his will is. But we do know God works through means and that he intends to use the means he has placed at our disposal. He wants us to use those means. And so one of the means at our disposal that we are allowed to do is we have the right to appeal to those in authority over us. We have the right to appeal to those in authority over us. As we've studied through Colossians, we've seen that. We've seen that those who are under authority can appeal to the authorities over them. We've seen that with wives and husbands. We've seen that last week with children with their parents. So, for example, even though a wife is commanded to submit to her husband, that doesn't mean she agrees with everything he says. In fact, she should be free to voice her opinions and her concerns and her perspective. Her counsel should be given on things, not to get things her way, but hopefully to give her husband a perspective that might actually be helpful to him. A wise husband will listen to that counsel. He'll listen to her concerns and appeals. But if there is an impasse, he is responsible for making the final decision. Well, when we look at Paul here, we find that he actually made an appeal to those who are over him. Why did he do that? Well, he believed he had information that would be helpful for them to consider when making their decision. So you go back to verse 9 again, and it says, when considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them and said to them, men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our own lives. We notice here Paul was respectful. It says here, interestingly, that he admonished them. The word means to warn, right? He warned them what could happen. And then he wisely counseled them, don't go. So he has amazing boldness here to speak when he perceived there would be disaster. And the reason why he's speaking is because he's concerned for everyone's well-being. Well, as we consider our current state of affairs, we believe we as Christians have information that our governing officials may not have considered. And that is that the stay-at-home order might actually be affecting people adversely, spiritually and physically. We were not created to live alone. We were created to live in community. And people are experiencing fear, hopelessness, loneliness, and despair. And so we desire our governing officials to consider this as they make their decisions. And we need to pray that if this is God's will, they would respond favorably. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to be sending out a letter to our governing officials probably tomorrow or sometime this week. And let's covenant to pray together that God would make it clear what his will is.